Hi, folks. This is Sarah Marshall, your operations architect, and this is the 9th episode in our Value Delivery Spine series and the final episode of our discussion around the stages. We'll have additional episodes that will cover the mechanisms that bind those stages together, but this is the last of the stages of converting strategy into strategic capability in the organization. And I'll start with a quote that I saw recently on a TikTok video from a serial entrepreneur who said that without sales and marketing, you won't have a business because you won't be selling things. But if you don't have operations, you won't be able to keep your customers. And that says a lot about what operations are designed to do, which is to provide consistency and ongoing capability after sales transaction or whatever kinds of transactions, that the operations in the organization maintain the business activities or maintain the organizational activities. And before we jump into designing processes and the design considerations, I'd like to put up this little flash of this Rube Goldberg machine. If you've seen any videos on TikTok or on YouTube, Rube Goldberg machine operating, it is very entertaining, most certainly. But the thing about Rube Goldberg machines is they're made out of whatever's available in the area. And that's a lot like how we start out with building operations. We build them with what we have in the moment to deal with a need that we have in the moment. But these kinds of machines don't work very well. So design considerations are important. So first, let's start with what constitutes an operation. And as we were mentioning before, the operations convert inputs into outputs. So you'll hear me talking about operations in this episode. You'll also hear me talking about processes. Pretty much they're interchangeable because operations tend to be either one giant process or a bundle of processes to maintain a capability. But you can't talk about process without talking about operations, and vice versa. You can't really talk about operations without process. So I'll be toggling back and forth in my descriptions. Just know we're aiming at the same thing. That ability to oversee, control, optimize, and ensure that we have consistent and high quality outputs. So what kinds of operations are there? Well, there's a couple of types to talk about. First, there's a continuous process that runs. And you can see there's a paddle wheel here and a mill. And as long as there's water running, that operation is going. There's a number of others that I've listed in here as examples. Utility delivery is continuous. Web services are continuous, etc. What it means is it's not always being used, but it's always ready for use. So the trigger for this mill here is to dump raw wheat into the grinder, into the mill, so that you can mill out flour. But that's the trigger to get something done. The process is continuously operating all the time. The next kind is an event-driven. Something triggers the process and then it works. There's lots of examples of this. Fraud detection is an example. Pop-ups are an example that you've engaged a website. One I like to use is in HR when you're doing recruiting, when you're doing hiring. The process trigger for the event is the posting of a job description, and then the process starts and ends when a candidate is hired in-house and brought in. The final is project type operation, and those are, you can consider temporary operations. They're only there for as long as the project is in process, and once it is, it's like the scaffolding that comes down once your project is done. So you've got continuous, you've got event-driven, and you've got temporary processes, project processes. Let's continue with those thoughts, though. What also shapes an operation is its purpose. It will have a very specific shape and feel depending on what it's supporting and what outputs you're trying to get. Two examples are the process that you use, the operation that you use to hire, to bring somebody into our team that effectively works with our team is going to look very different than a process that supports product launches. Also, we have to consider maturity. When we're starting out, we'll have something very temporary and vague. much like the operation we showed at the top of the episode. It could be very simple, and that may be enough, or we may need to build it out into something much more sophisticated to support high stakes processes and key delivery processes, and then we might have to build out something that looks quite different than our original process or operation that we put in place. Now, I have these pictures of these two cities because they demonstrate something that's really crucial to design, something you need to decide what you're going to do when you come into it. When you're designing, you're institutionalizing a set of activities. Those activities you could design for what you're seeing in front of you, or you can design for what you want to have be there. And these two cities are a good example of both of those kinds of thinking. The context behind these cities the similarities are they're both small, compact cities. They live on very hilly terrain. They're peninsula-based port cities that provide services to shipping, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are all similar. But if you look at the downtown inset for each city, you can see they've been designed very differently. The Boston design is very circuitous. It has a lot of dead ends. It has odd-shaped spaces. Whereas the San Francisco street pattern, the grid it's laid out very specific grid. The difference is that when Boston was being designed, it originally had cow paths, and those cow paths turned into, by nature of use, roads. And those roads were eventually paved, and then a whole city infrastructure was built around that organic, behavioral-based design. Whereas San Francisco was designed in 1838 by a Swiss merchant captain, and of course, being Swiss, it was very structured and specific and efficient. And that captain designed out a grid pattern for Yerba Buena, which started right about here. And then as the city became San Francisco, the name was changed. It just kept growing out, and that grid pattern followed the growth of the city. So this is a more idealized for efficiency pattern. It was, well thought out up front. There's constraints it had to live with, like green spaces and mountains over here, but in general, it followed that very defined structure that was set up. So those are two different approaches to design. So let's continue through that process. In the planning process, you do want to take behavioral considerations into account, because people are behaving that way for a certain reason. You want to really understand that before you start designing, because there's some critical lessons you might pull out, even if you're not going to design for those specific behaviors. Additionally, we have to consider what the operation is being designed for. What is the output? What kind of performance standards do we have to operate? What constraints do we have? All those need to be considered in the planning process as well as the ecosystem. What are the other systems in which we are operating? What other operations are we dependent on? What operations are we providing information to? What is the general ecosystem of the organization, and what are we dealing with there? Maybe regulatory factors or political factors all have to be considered in design. And when you're designing, you start with the task flow. This is the human behavior thing. I need to do X, and then I need to do Y, and then I need to do Z. I may have some decisions to make. And there are some task flows which lend themselves very much to institutionalizing into process. I'll give an example. When I design an OKR process to manage commitments, I like it to be consistent every time. Whereas the content of the update will be different. The structure of the update will always be the same and always be delivered in a way that decision makers can quickly digest it and understand what issues are there. So that is a set of tasks that very much lend themselves to building a process around. If I'm designing, say, a quarterly business review, I probably won't want to structure that much. Maybe structure in how to get the performance updates, but what the content and what we're trying to accomplish in that quarterly business review will be dictated by circumstances. So I like to keep that very loose. But the things that we can build into process, we can structure a formal process around with constraints for that process, performance requirements for the process, output requirements for the process, engagement requirements, so that everybody operates the same way when they're doing that set of tasks. And then for those that are very consistent and that for which we can get some real efficiencies and effectiveness by putting them into a systems platform, then we can design a platform around them as well. But you start with the task flow and work your way to the more heavily institutionalized aspects by working through the architecture of the process. Finally, the outputs. Of course, our output has to have high quality, whether it is a candidate that is hired and fits well into the team, or a product launch, or supply chain performance in replenishing our demand, etc. The output has to be high quality and measured for high quality, as well as the performance of the process. We also want to consider what we're going to monitor in the way of performance. Of course, we're going to monitor the output for performance, but what other constraints? Is it velocity? Is it efficiency? What are the things that we need to measure and mark for the process and ensure that we are refining our process to deliver on? And finally, we're going to have information that we manage through that process, and that information will continue to support other activities and analyses, communications, etc. We want to figure out how we want to manage that information as well. So these are the big considerations for operations design. And we'll jump into some last considerations here. What triggers the process? What is the ecosystem we're living in? What changes have occurred within the ecosystem? What transformation do we want to complete? And what outcomes are we looking for? So within the ecosystem, ensure that we understand where our environment is and where it's going to be, so we can design for those considerations. What triggers are we going to deal with? It could be a single trigger, dumping the wheat into the mill to get flour, or it could require multiple inputs. That's for you non-nerds, that's a logic gate down there that says you need to have two triggers in a positive state to get something out, to start the process. You can have any level of complexity on these triggers. And then in that transformation process, what are the process considerations? What tasks do we need to consider? What transactions must we manage and facilitate? What inputs do we get from folks? What communications are we providing to prompt to the next step? What collaborations are required? Can any of this be automated? All those considerations. And then finally, what goes in and out at each task step? What data is required? How does it get into the system? How is it managed? What's the quality level of the data, and how do we keep it there? And what are other interim outputs that we need to consider in the task steps? And then finally, there's the results. Are we meeting expectations with that output? Are we supporting the right decisions? Do we understand the gaps between the output of our operation and the ecosystem at large? And so on and so forth. So these are the big considerations for operations design. The last thing I want to talk about is how people are going to break your perfect operation. So you can design with a lot of intentionality, and you can design and test your capability to see if you've identified most of the places that people can break things, but people will always find a way. There is a great video on TikTok of this designed unit like this. It's a canister with a top that has all these shapes on top, and you can put the blocks through the shapes. And you can see in the inset, the designer is watching somebody put stuff in. And the first block was a square block, and the person put it through the square hole, and the designer was so happy. And then the person picked up a round block and put it through the square hole, and the designer was crestfallen. And the user continued to pick up blocks of every shape and push them through the square hole, and the designer was devastated. Besides being entertaining, except for that designer, It does illustrate a good point that no matter how well you design an operation, somebody will figure out how to do something with it you hadn't intended. And you have to take that in and watch the behavior after it's pushed out. And then if you need them to do it a different way, you're going to have to fix your design to do it. The other thing people will do is shortcuts. So you have to make a determination when they start making shortcuts. Did you really need all the steps that you had in there or all the information you were capturing? Or can you do without it? And if you can do without it, then shorten the process. If you absolutely need it, then you need to design guardrails around that process to ensure that there's no shortcuts. So the summary here is operations are designed to give consistency to the organization, and give consistency to customer experience, give consistency to the candidates you're hiring, etc. But it's a clear set of activities that get you through a process and comes out the other side with a desired outcome. These operations have a number of common considerations that need to be taken into account when designing. Some of the big things in design are what changes have occurred in your ecosystem that you need to consider or are coming that you need to consider. What triggers the process into action and how do you design for that? What transformations are occurring in the process? And then finally, what outputs are coming out of that process and how do they need to be managed? If you want more information on building resilient operations, read my article, Building Resilient Operations, at my website, blog, www.operations-architect.com. Thank you so much, and we'll be back with those mechanisms next time around.